You stood at the kitchen doorway watching her work the hot grease with a spoon she'd never once washed with soap, just wiped and kept seasoning. That knowledge lived in her hands. It left with her. Here are 30 forgotten old-fashioned soul food treats no one makes anymore. Nobody ever bought them at a store. That was the whole point. Cracklins, those thick golden squares of fried pork skin with fat still clinging underneath, were made in the yard in a cast iron pot that took most of a winter Saturday to finish right. The fat was scored from the hog's back in 2-inch squares and dropped into hot lard in small batches so the temperature never dropped. If the fat cooled even slightly, you got chewy instead of crisp, and chewy was a disgrace. The secret was frying them twice, once low to render, then again at high heat until the skin blistered and shattered between your back teeth with a sound you felt in your jaw. They were eaten hot out of a paper bag while the grease was still visible on your fingertips, and what remained after the snacking went crumbled into cornbread batter. Back in the 1940s and 50s, that crackling pot announced to the whole neighborhood that someone had a fresh hog and knew what to do with it. Today, what passes for cracklins in a gas station bag barely resembles what once came out of that yard. Before the ice cream truck turned down your street, there was the Huckerbuck lady, and her porch was the only stop that mattered on a July afternoon. Huckerbucks were Kool-Aid mixed sweet enough to ache your back teeth, poured into small waxed cups and frozen overnight. The ratio was everything. Too little sugar and the ice went grainy. Too much and it never froze hard enough to eat without a spoon. By the 1940s, every black neighborhood in New Orleans had at least one house where a dime got you something cold out of a brown paper bag. You worked at it with your lips until the top softened, then tilted the cup back until the last syrup ran down your arm to your elbow. That woman is gone now. That porch is gone, and that sweetness is gone with them. No recipe was ever written down. None needed to be. Fried sweet potato slices were the first sweet thing most children in these households ever tasted. Not a dessert, just a cast iron skillet on an ordinary evening. The potato was peeled and sliced thin, pressed into lard, heated until a drop of water popped sharp and fast on the surface. They cooked without batter, without seasoning, beyond a pinch of salt until the edges darkened and the natural sugars caramelized into a crust that was simultaneously crisp and tender. Records from the slave narratives collected in the 1930s document this exact preparation. Enslaved people frying sweet potatoes in lard as far back as the early plantation era, turning the most abundant crop they were permitted to grow into something approaching indulgence. Through the 40s and 50s, a plate of these was set out while supper was still cooking and was gone before the main dish was ready. The pan gets close now, the smell gets right, but the taste is always a half step away. It came to the table in the dish it was baked in, and you served it with a spoon. The name told you everything. Spoon bread, the soft cousin to cornbread that could not hold its shape long enough to be sliced, had to be scooped before it deflated back into its parts. The technique was exact. Fine cornmeal, scalded with boiling water first, eggs beaten in separately for lift, milk for body, butter for the soul of it, baked until the top puffed and bronzed and wobbled like a savory custard. It traces to the soft corn porridges of Native American cooking that African American cooks in the antebellum South made their own, a dish carrying older knowledge into households with no written record of where it came from. The finished dish was warm and yielding, rich from the egg and sweet from the corn in a way plain cornbread never achieved. You scooped it into a bowl and poured potlikker over the center. If your grandmother brought it to the table, you knew something significant was about to happen. She was at the fig tree before full light, picking only the ones that had split slightly at the crown. Those were the sweetest, the ones you could not sell or ship. Fig preserves from the backyard tree happened every August, whether anyone asked or not. The figs were halved and cooked down with sugar and a lemon rind quarter until the kitchen smelled like the inside of something ancient and sweet, then put up in mason jars lined along the windowsill. In African American household gardens throughout the rural South, fig trees were planted deliberately. They asked for little, produced reliably in thin soil, and gave back something that felt like luxury in lean seasons. A hot biscuit, split open, still steaming, and a spoonful of thick amber preserves spread into the dough. Nobody ate them at the table. She never used a recipe. The color told her when they were ready. Cold months had their own flavor, and it came from Cracklins crumbled still warm into coarse cornmeal batter, where the unreleased fat melted into the dough and gave it a richness that plain cornbread could never produce. Baked in a cast iron skillet until the sides pulled away from the pan, it tasted simultaneously of corn and pork, with pockets of crispy crackling scattered through the crumb. The encyclopedias of African American foodways trace crackling bread to the earliest post-emancipation kitchens, where nothing from a slaughtered hog was discarded. Fat, skin, and meat scraps all found their way into this bread, turning the waste of butchering into one of the most flavorful things that ever came out of an iron skillet. You could not fake it with commercially bought pork rinds, which had been rendered dry and stripped of the fat they needed to give back. Real crackling bread required fresh cracklings from that morning. Any cook who knew her kitchen could taste the difference in the first bite. Before sunrise on Sunday mornings in New Orleans, you could hear them before you saw them. Black women moving through the French Quarter streets with coal-heated braziers and baskets balanced on their heads, calling out in Creole French, "Belles Calas, tout chaud," beautiful rice fritters, very hot. Calas were leftover cooked rice fermented overnight in a yeast batter, dropped by spoonfuls into hot oil and fried until golden and hollow inside, dusted with powdered sugar and eaten while your fingers were still burning. The recipe traveled from West Africa, where rice cultivation was a cultural inheritance, and these women were doing something beyond selling breakfast food. The Code Noir, French colonial law in Louisiana, prohibited enslavers from requiring Sunday labor, and that single day of economic freedom allowed these women to accumulate the money that would eventually purchase their own freedom or the freedom of their children. By the early 20th century, the challah women had largely vanished from the streets, and the tang of the overnight ferment they carried in those baskets vanished with them. You did not fry bananas unless you knew what you were doing with heat, and the women who made banana croquettes understood that a soft, spotted banana was not going bad. It was reaching its moment. Overripe bananas were mashed smooth, formed into small ovals, dipped in egg batter, then fried until the outside became a caramelized shell, while the inside dissolved into something sweeter than any fresh banana could offer. The technique required reading the oil temperature without a thermometer. The crust had to set before the banana went liquid and collapsed the shape. Food historian Sonia Norwood has documented banana croquettes among the lost Black American treats nearly vanished from home kitchens, noting they were a church supper standard through the early 20th century. Overripe fruit nobody else wanted transformed into something that left the serving plate before any other dish did. The part of the watermelon everyone threw away, the white rind between the red flesh and the green skin, was the part she kept. Watermelon rind preserves required soaking the rind overnight in lime water to firm the texture, then simmering it in a syrup of sugar and lemon juice, sometimes with ginger or clove, until the rind transformed from something chalky and tasteless into a jewel-clear preserve with a faint sweetness behind a warm spice undertone. The technique traces to African agricultural knowledge. Watermelon is native to West Africa, and enslaved people who cultivated it in the American South understood the entire fruit had value. Through the 1940s and 50s, these preserves were put up alongside the peach butter and tomato relish, lined in the cellar beside the other jars. The rind that others threw out, Black households turned into something that went on biscuits at breakfast and pound cake at Sunday supper. The lime water soak, the sugar ratio, the moment the syrup set, none of that was written down. It lived in the cook's hands. Sassafras tea was the original root beer. Dried bark simmered in water until the kitchen filled with a smell so dense and sweet and faintly medicinal that anyone who grew up with it would recognize that scent a lifetime later. In African American households throughout the Deep South through the 1930s and into the 50s, sassafras root was kept in a tin on the herb shelf, pulled out when someone felt a cold coming in spring as a tonic, and in between simply because the tea cost nothing when you knew where the trees grew. The roots were dug in early spring before the leaves opened, when the bark held the most oil, scrubbed, dried, and stored. A handful of pieces simmered in water 20 minutes, strained, sweetened with cane syrup. The taste was warm and anise sweet with a woodsy depth that commercial root beer only ever gestured toward. She knew which trees to use and which to leave. When she was gone, the tin stayed on the shelf. Nobody touched it. Long before any jar of peanut butter sat in any pantry, the peanut, roasted until the skins cracked, ground by hand in a wooden mortar into a rough, oily paste, was the starting point for a soup that carried West African culinary memory straight into the American South. Peanut soup traces to the groundnut stews of West and Central Africa, where peanuts had been a cooking staple for centuries before the slave trade began, and enslaved people brought the technique across the ocean, packed inside memory. Raw peanuts were roasted until the oils opened, ground to paste, then worked into broth with onions, salt, and whatever the season allowed, sometimes sweet potato, sometimes nothing, but the paste thickening the pot. The finished soup was rich without cream or added fat. The peanut delivered its own body. In homes through the 1930s and 40s, it stretched a meal while reaching towards something older than this country. By the 1970s, the slow simmer gave way and the soup went quiet. The Praline women of New Orleans could read the weather before they started cooking, because the humidity in the air that morning would determine whether the candy set, and no one had ever written that into a recipe. They moved through the French market and quarter streets with flat baskets, selling pecan pralines made from a formula that had evolved across 2 continents. The original French confection was sugared almonds, but the Creole women who took over the making substituted pecans, added cream to round the texture, and cooked the candy to a fudge-like state that melted in a long, buttery wave before crumbling at the last moment. What they were doing over those copper pots was more than candy making. For many of these women, praline sales were the primary mechanism by which they accumulated money to purchase their own freedom or the freedom of their children. The mastery required, reading the sugar, working the mixture fast before it hardened, was passed mother to daughter in kitchens that no longer exist. The women who made the real thing are long past telling you what was different. Fried fruit fritters were the kind of treat that happened when something was about to go past its moment. Peaches too soft, apples bruised in the basket, berries that would not last another day. The fruit was sliced, dipped in a thin batter of flour, egg, and milk, then lowered into hot fat in a cast iron pan until the batter puffed and bronzed and the fruit The inside collapsed into something warm and sweet and barely holding its shape. Historical records document apple and fruit fritters in enslaved households as early as the plantation era. The technique of dipping fruit in batter before frying was a direct continuation of West African frying traditions brought across the Atlantic. The practice turned the softest, most damaged fruit into the most requested item at the table. Mothers made them from what was left, almost without planning, and children remembered them decades later as one of the best things they ever ate. By the 1960s, as refrigeration made overripe fruit less common, the fritter went quiet. If the fritter came together in minutes from what was going soft, peanut brittle took the whole afternoon, and a thermometer you probably didn't have. Raw peanuts, still in their red skins, went into a boiling sugar syrup that had to reach exactly the right stage before the whole pot was poured onto a greased surface and pulled thin while still hot enough to move. The peanut made the journey from South America to West Africa and back on the slave ships, and African American farmers in the South were cultivating it commercially decades before it became a mainstream American crop. In households through the 40s and 50s, brittle was made in the fall, broken into irregular shards, and kept in a tin on the top shelf. You did not eat it casually, it was kept. When you got a piece, the snap of it and the roasted sweetness that bloomed after tasted like fall and patience and someone who knew what she was doing. Sweet potato butter was not butter and not jam. It lived in its own category and spread across a biscuit in a way that nothing else did. The potatoes were roasted until completely soft, pushed through a sieve, then cooked down low with sugar, cinnamon, and nutmeg, stirred constantly until it reached a consistency between apple butter and soft candy. Sonia Norwood and other food historians documenting lost Black American traditions have identified sweet potato butter as one of the most completely vanished preparations in the African American kitchen, surviving past the Depression years into the 1950s before convenience spreads made it seem unnecessary. The color was a deep, burnished orange. The smell, when the jar opened, was warm and spiced and immediate. Once you had it, a biscuit without it seemed like something was wrong. You only got laced cornbread if someone in the kitchen knew what they were doing with heat. The batter was thinner than any cornbread batter had a right to be, almost as thin as crepe batter, made from just cornmeal, water, and salt, no egg, no milk, no leavening. A spoonful of it dropped into a skillet full of very hot oil, spread almost flat, and fried into a thin, lacy round with holes through the center where the batter was too thin to hold, and the edges became a deep golden filigree that shattered at the first bite. The technique required the oil at exactly the right temperature. Too cool and the lace never formed, too hot and it burned before the structure set. In households across the rural South through the 1940s and 50s, lace cornbread was made alongside salt pork or a pot of beans. It tasted almost entirely of crust. The recipe cannot be written down. The point is the hand and the eye and the temperature of the oil. Salt rising bread smelled terrible while it was rising, and the women who made it knew that and made it anyway. And if you said something about the smell, you were told to go wait outside. The starter was made not from yeast, but from a fermented cornmeal mash. Cornmeal, salt, sometimes a little sugar, left in a warm place overnight to develop the bacterial culture that gave the finished bread its distinctive, sharp, slightly funky flavor. The technique traces to Southern households where commercial yeast was unavailable, and African American families in the rural South made it through the 1930s and 40s before packaged yeast made the process seem unnecessary. The starter had to be kept at exactly the right warmth. Too cool and it died, too hot and it died. The bread produced a dense, chewy crumb with a tang that people either loved immediately or never got used to. Nobody in the family complained about the smell more than once. The pulling started when the sorghum syrup reached the right color. Not the thin pour of fresh syrup, but the thicker, more resistant pull of a batch cooked long enough to hold its shape when stretched. Sorghum taffy was a winter kitchen event. Someone buttered their hands, someone else took the other end of the mass, and the pulling went back and forth across the kitchen until the syrup shifted from brown to gold and gained enough air to twist into ropes and cut into pieces that hardened slowly as they cooled. Encyclopedia records document sorghum seeds being brought from Africa during the slave trade. Enslaved people knew the plant from their home cultures, and sorghum became one of the primary sweeteners in African American households throughout the South when cane sugar was too expensive for daily cooking. Through the 40s and into the 50s, taffy pulling nights gathered the whole household. She is gone now, and no one left knows how to keep the syrup at exactly the right heat to make it pull right. If you grew up in a certain neighborhood in a certain decade, you knew the bean pie man before you ever tasted the pie. You saw him on the corner in his bow tie with a stack of white boxes, and the pie inside was something that had nothing to do with what you expected from navy beans. Bean pie was developed in Detroit in the 1930s within the Nation of Islam, substituting navy beans for sweet potato and a custard-style filling. The beans, cooked soft, mashed smooth, mixed with eggs, sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and evaporated milk, baked in a pastry shell until the filling set. The result tasted almost exactly like sweet potato pie. The same sweetness, the same spice, made from something the plantation kitchen had never used for dessert. During the civil rights era of the 1960s, Nation of Islam mosques served bean pie at community gatherings and fed movement organizers throughout the country. Very few people outside that community make it today. Benne wafers were tiny, almost translucent sesame seed cookies that shattered into nothing the moment they touched your tongue, and the women who made them knew they were working with something old enough to have crossed an ocean. Benne is the Wolof word for sesame, brought to the American South through the slave trade beginning around 1730, when enslaved people from West and Central Africa carried sesame seeds with them, sometimes sewn into their clothing, as both food and talisman, since sesame was believed to bring good luck in several West African cultures. Thomas Jefferson documented enslaved people at Monticello pressing sesame oil and incorporating Benne into their cooking in the late 1700s. The wafer was made from toasted sesame seeds, butter, sugar, flour, and egg, dropped in small spoonfuls onto a baking sheet and spread so thin they were almost laced from the oven. In Charleston and the low country of South Carolina, Benne wafers survived longer than almost anywhere else as a distinctly African American confection. Outside that region, the knowledge is nearly gone. Lane cake was the kind of cake that announced itself before you cut it. 4 white layers held together by a filling so dense with pecans, raisins, coconut, and bourbon that you could smell the whiskey across the room. Named after Emma Rylander Lane of Clayton, Alabama, who published the original recipe in her 1898 cookbook, the cake became a fixture of African American celebration kitchens through the early 20th century, made for weddings, funerals, and the kind of holidays that required the best thing in the house on the table. The filling was the whole point. Egg yolks, sugar, butter, and bourbon cooked with fruit and nuts until thick enough to hold 4 layers upright. The contrast between the clean white meringue exterior and the whiskey dark filling when you sliced it was the whole drama of the dessert. The women who made lane cakes for every occasion did so as a statement. I have the time, I have the skill, and someone here is worth this effort. The last one most people remember was at a funeral. Bread pudding was born from the logic of nothing wasted. The heels of bread too dry to eat, the last bits of biscuit, the stale rolls from the day before, all torn into a baking dish and soaked in a custard of eggs, milk, sugar, and vanilla, then baked until the top bronzed and the inside set into something soft and warm. The soul food pot and other food historians note that bread pudding reflects the waste-nothing philosophy of these kitchens, not because waste was a virtue, but because nothing could be spared, and so the cook found a way to make something better from what was already there. The technique brought together European bread pudding traditions with the specific resource reality of households where flour was expensive and bread was stretched as far as it would go. It was served warm from the oven, sometimes with a whiskey sauce that turned the dish into something a child was not supposed to have, but got anyway. By the time packaged desserts made the conditions that created bread pudding obsolete, the dish was already fading from the everyday table. Italian cream cake was not Italian. The name is a mystery nobody has convincingly solved, and it does not matter because the cake belonged to Louisiana and to the Black church tradition that kept it alive for generations. Layers of butter cake made with buttermilk and beaten egg whites for lift, covered in cream cheese, frosting full of toasted pecans and coconut. It was the kind of cake you only saw at events that required the best in the house. Food historians of Black Louisiana have linked it to Dillard University in New Orleans, the state's oldest HBCU, and to the church supper circuit, where it became a marker of celebration and belonging for more than a century. The last woman in many families who could deliver has been gone for years, and the cake has not come back to the table the way it should. Sweet potato candy, sometimes called slips, was made when the potatoes came in heaviest and the kitchen was already warm from other cooking. The potato was boiled completely soft, mashed with butter, sugar, and sometimes a little cinnamon, then rolled into small balls or pressed into flat rounds and left to cool on wax paper until the outside firmed. No candy thermometer, no technique written anywhere. The consistency that told you when to stop came from testing the warm mixture against a wet finger, and that knowledge was entirely personal. In households through the 1940s and 50s, children made these alongside their grandmothers, rolling the warm mixture between their palms while it was still almost too hot to hold. She showed you without explaining it. You learned the temperature by burning your hands exactly once, and after that you knew. She has been gone for years now. You have made them since. They come out looking right, tasting close, but missing the warmth that only came from being made at her elbow. The last thing on this list is not the most obscure, but it is the one that comes back in the middle of ordinary afternoons without warning. The smell of peanut butter fudge cooling on wax paper on the kitchen counter, so specific and so tied to a particular person in a particular kitchen that when it surfaces, it carries the whole room with it. Homemade peanut butter fudge was made from peanut butter, sugar, butter, and milk cooked together to the softball stage, then beaten until it thickened and poured into a pan to set. Nothing complicated, nothing rare. But the person who made it is gone, and the kitchen is gone, and the particular afternoon light through that window while it cooled is something you can only access now by closing your eyes and holding very still. That is what this whole list has been about. Not recipes, not history, the specific weight of a specific afternoon that will not come back. The pit, the smoke, the long, slow fire. Long before a barbecue became America's backyard ritual, it was the work of enslaved African Americans drawing on a tradition traced back to West Africa, where the Hausa had a word for the practice, babake, meaning to build a great fire and cook slowly over it. On the plantation, the most labor-intensive cooking was assigned to enslaved workers. They dug the pits, managed the coals, stayed up through the night turning the meat, and seasoned it with hot pepper and vinegar, a flavor profile rooted directly in West African cooking, where pepper sauces had been a staple for centuries. The slaveholder attended the feast. He didn't tend the fire. When the Great Migration carried black families north in the early 20th century, the pit masters brought their technique with them into Chicago, Kansas City, Detroit, where entire regional styles formed around their methods. Today, the word pit master is celebrated. The tradition it names, the unbroken line from West Africa to the American backyard, is still waiting for its full credit. Pinto beans and fatback was the dish that nobody bragged about and everybody loved. Dried beans, soaked overnight, started on the stove before anyone was fully awake, with a thick slab of fatback, salted, cured pork fat from the back of the hog, going in whole so its fat could slowly melt into the broth. Onion, garlic, a little black pepper, and 4 hours of low heat. The beans softened into something so deeply flavored that a bowl over white rice with a square of cornbread was all anyone needed. The secret was the salt. You never added it early, because salt at the beginning toughens the bean skin and keeps the center hard. You waited until the beans had given in completely, until the broth had thickened on its own. Only then. In Jim Crow era, black households across the South, this dish appeared weekly, not because nothing else was available, but because no one had yet invented a reason to stop making it. That is a kind of loyalty that belongs only to the best food. Cube steak was what you bought when you wanted something that felt like a real dinner without paying for a real cut of beef. The mechanically tenderized round steak came cross-hatched with the butcher's machine marks, and those channels made it cook fast and absorb seasoning deep. You seasoned it with salt, pepper, garlic powder, and paprika, dredged it through flour, and laid it into a hot skillet. 4 minutes aside, no more, because longer made it tough again and defeated the whole purpose. The flour crust turned golden, the center stayed just past pink, and the drippings in the pan were too good to leave. A splash of water, a stir, and you had thin pan gravy over rice. Cube steak ran about 60 cents a pound at peak 1970s inflation. Once you learned the heat and the timing, you never overcomplicated it. You have eaten thousands of them at diners, drive-thrus, restaurants, charging $14 for truffle versions. The French fry. What you may not know is who brought it to America. His name was James Hemings, and he was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. In 1784, Jefferson took Hemings to France to be trained in French cuisine. Hemings became the first American of any race to receive that training. He mastered pommes frites, the cream sauces, the technique. He brought it all back and ran the kitchen at Monticello and later the White House, serving the dishes he had learned, including what Jefferson's household records noted as French fries at a White House dinner in 1802. Jefferson is often credited with introducing them. Hemings negotiated his freedom in 1796, died in 1801, and appears as a footnote when he appears at all. He never saw his influence become a global industry. The fries survived. The name that made it did not. She started them the night before, always the night before, because a deviled egg made the morning of a church supper was an egg with no character. Yolks came out and went through a fork, mixed with Duke's mayonnaise, yellow mustard, a little sweet pickle relish, paprika on top, and something else she never told anyone. Every cook had a something else, and knowing what it was meant you were trusted enough to be taught. At every black gathering in the 1960s, church supper, family reunion, repast after a burial, deviled eggs appeared on the same church plate with the divots shaped just right, always gone before the main dishes were touched. There was an unspoken rule: you did not take the last one without checking that the person who made them had already eaten. She always made sure everyone else ate first anyway, and now the plate sits in a cabinet and no one remembers what she put in them to make them taste the way they did. Fried bologna on white bread with yellow mustard was not a meal anyone admitted to company, but behind closed doors, it was a Tuesday lifesaver every black household knew. You took the thick-cut bologna, not the sandwich slices, scored the edges with a knife so it wouldn't curl into a dome in the pan, then laid it in a dry cast iron skillet with no added oil because bologna had enough fat to fry itself. You let it sit until the edges crisped and the center blistered and darkened, then flipped it once and gave it another minute before it came out crackling and fragrant. Slapped on white bread with enough French's mustard to cut through the grease, that was supper. Some households added a slice of yellow cheese on top while the bologna was still hot enough to melt it. Some fried an egg alongside. In the 1970s, when grocery inflation hit black working class households especially hard, a pound of thick-cut bologna ran about 50 cents and fed 3 people. And that math was the whole point. Kids who ate it never forgot it. Adults who made it told no one. On Sunday mornings in the French Quarter, before the city woke, you could hear them, the Calas women, moving through the streets with coal-heated braziers balanced on their heads. Calas were small rice fritters, fried golden and dusted with powdered sugar, traced directly to West African food culture. When enslaved Africans were brought to Louisiana, they carried rice cultivation expertise without which the colony's rice economy could not have functioned. Provision of French colonial law, the Code Noir, prohibited enslavers from requiring work on Sundays. That day of rest became a lifeline. Black women used it to cook, sell, and earn. They became the Calas women, feeding the city every Sunday morning, each fritter an unbroken connection to a continent taken from them. Calas have nearly disappeared from New Orleans now. The beignet is on every corner. The challah is in the archives. The women who made them are not. Salmon croquettes showed up on the table at least twice a month in 1970s black households, and the whole thing started with a can of pink salmon that cost less than 30 cents. You drained it, picked out the bones, mashed it with a beaten egg, crushed saltines, chopped onion, and enough seasoned salt and black pepper to make it smell like something worth eating. The mixture got shaped into flat oval patties and fried in a cast iron skillet until the outside crackled gold. What most people outside these kitchens never understood was the cornmeal. A light dredge before the patties hit, the grease gave them that thin, audible crust no breadcrumb could replicate. The Los Angeles Culinary Art Club had documented their version back in 1936, rolled in crushed cornflakes and served on toast. By the 1970s, every grandmother had her own variation, and none of them needed a recipe card to get it right. For almost 70 years, Nashville hot chicken was a secret that belonged to one community. It lived on Jefferson Street in Nashville's black neighborhood, made and eaten by the people who invented it. The story goes back to the 1930s when a man named Thornton Prince came home late one too many times. His girlfriend loaded his fried chicken with so much cayenne it was meant as punishment. He loved it. He and his brothers perfected the recipe, opened a chicken shack on Jefferson Street, and for the next 7 decades, hot chicken stayed in the neighborhood that built it. Then it crept out. By the time KFC launched Nashville hot chicken nationally in 2016, food magazines were writing about it as if it had appeared from nowhere. Prince's Hot Chicken Shack, the original, still run by Thornton's great niece, Andre Prince Jeffries, got a footnote. 70 years of community, one national rollout. The name on the sign changed, and the story got shorter with every new franchise that opened. Smothered chicken was a Sunday centerpiece in most black households of the 1960s, and it announced the week was over and the family was home. A whole chicken cut into pieces, seasoned deep with salt, black pepper, garlic powder, and paprika, dredged in flour and browned in a cast iron skillet until golden. Then the chicken came out and the gravy went in. Onions, bell pepper, stock scraped up from the bottom where all the flavor had pooled. The chicken went back in, the lid went on, and the heat went low for an hour. By the time it was done, the meat had given everything to the gravy, and the gravy had given it back. In kitchens from Birmingham to Chicago, this was the dish that made you feel like someone meant for you to be there. You can still find the recipe. What you cannot find, what no amount of technique will replace, is the woman who stood at that stove and made you feel like the most important person in the world just by handing you a plate. Before any other dish landed on the stove, the pinto beans went on in the morning, cooking slow and low until the kitchen smelled like Saturday, even on a Wednesday. A pound of dried pintos cost a dime in the 1970s, soaked overnight in cold water, then drained and covered fresh in a pot with a piece of fatback or a smoked ham hock tucked down into the center. No salt until the last hour, because adding it too early kept the skins tough, and anyone raised in these kitchens knew that rule without ever being told. It passed from hand to hand through watching, not reading. The pot simmered on the back burner while the whole day happened around it, and by evening, the beans had turned thick and creamy, the broth a deep reddish brown steeped through with smoky pork fat. Served over rice with a splash of hot sauce and a piece of cornbread to sop the Potlikker, pinto beans were a complete meal that cost almost nothing and gave back everything. They taste almost right when you make them now. Almost. The word gumbo is not French. It is not Southern folklore. It comes from Ngombo, the Bantu word for okra, and okra is where the story begins. Some historians believe enslaved Africans carried okra seeds braided into their hair before the Middle Passage crossing, a form of preservation ensuring the food culture would survive. In West and Central Africa, okra had been a kitchen staple for centuries, thickening soups and feeding families. Once it arrived in the American South, it transformed the cuisine and then kept going. Okra spread into kitchens from Louisiana to the Carolinas, then across the Caribbean, then into South Asian and North African cooking, where it still appears without any acknowledgement of the West African tradition that cultivated and carried it here. Today, it shows up on farm-to-table menus, praised for its thickening properties and nutrition. The chefs who champion it rarely mention the women who carry its seeds braided into their hair so that something from home would survive the water. Canned salmon cost almost nothing, and in the hands of a cook who knew what she was doing, it became something that tasted like it cost everything. Drained, picked clean of bones, mixed with crushed crackers or cornmeal, a beaten egg, chopped onion, and black pepper, shaped into patties by hand and fried in hot oil until each side went brown and the outside crackled when you touched it with a fork. The Florida Avenue Grill in Washington, D.C., one of the oldest continuously operating soul food restaurants in the world, serves salmon cakes from its earliest days alongside collard greens and chitterlings. At home, they were a Tuesday staple, quick, filling, cheap, and good enough to make you forget they were any of those things. The cook knew when the oil was right not by temperature, but by sound, a steady, confident sizzle the moment the patty hit the pan. If it sputtered slow, the oil was cold. If it screamed, it was too hot. She knew the difference in her sleep, and she is gone now, and no one in that kitchen has made them since. Hamburger steak with onion gravy over rice could turn a pound of ground beef into a full dinner for 4, and your grandmother pulled it together in 30 minutes, flat after a long day on her feet. She seasoned the meat with garlic powder, onion powder, black pepper, and cayenne, patted it into thick oval patties, and seared them in a hot skillet until both sides were dark and the kitchen smelled sweet and salty. Out came the patties, in went sliced onions to soften in the drippings, then a spoonful of flour stirred into the fat to start the roux, darkened with broth or water until it thickened into gravy the color of dark wood. The patties went back in, the lid went on, and everything simmered low until the meat was tender enough to cut with a fork. She always made more rice than she needed because she always knew someone would want more. You can make this tonight with the same $1.50 worth of ground beef she used. Without her at that stove, it still won't taste exactly the way it did. These kitchens have gone quiet. Leave the name of one dish you remember in the comments. Someone else is looking for it too.